not having a memorial. And then they discovered something remarkable after 10 or 12 years of debate as to the nature of this memorial. And those of you who have been to the Berlin Memorial, one of the elements about the Berlin Memorial that is problematic is you can see out of the maze virtually all the time, which means that in essence you're protected as you go through the experience. Because you can always refer to yourself to time and place and get out of it, while if you could never see out of it, it would be too frightening. If you can see out of it all the time, it's a little bit too loose. They then discovered that it didn't work, not for the older generation where it worked magnificently, but for the younger generation that didn't know the story. Therefore, they had to dig down underneath and create, inch for inch, what is one of the most powerful Holocaust exhibitions, which is the educational experience underneath the memorial, because a memorial that doesn't tell the story is insufficient for a community that no longer knows the story, meaning the younger people who did not live through it. We faced the problem. Now, we created a language of museum, which is a language of museum that I shape in all of my work, and that is we create a language museum, which is a museum as a storytelling institution. There are three storytelling mechanisms in the modern world. Storytelling, by the way, is as old as what our Bible, both of our Bibles, in fact. The Bible begins with the story of creation. It goes through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It goes through the story of Moses, and it continues on and on in narrative. And what are the Gospels if not the story of those who lived in proximity to Jesus, telling that story, re-speaking that story again and again and again, and telling it as narrative. When I deal with it, I sometimes say, you know, the essence of Jewish thinking is instead of saying in unity there is strength, we say 2 dogs killed a lion. How did 2 dogs kill a lion? Why did 2 dogs? That's where commentary comes in. But the idea of a storytelling institution, so what are the storytelling institutions of the contemporary world? A novel, a movie, and a museum. What's the difference between a movie and a museum? A movie has a captive audience and moving imagery. And a museum has captive imagery and a moving audience. And consequently, if you're going to shape the museum, you shape by the nature of the story you tell, all of the elements that move the audience from one stage to another, to a third, to a fourth. And there are different techniques. You can either have the freedom to move, or you try to do it with sound and light and narration, or you try to do it with the sheer power of the narrative. The second principle we had is, if I were to come to the Metropolitan and give them 100 Picassos, they would develop a Picasso wing. If I gave them 20 Rembrandts, they would deal with a Rembrandt wing, and then they'd supplement it with Dutch masters. Because most museums essentially tell the story of the artifacts they have. We reversed the metaphor and we said we want to tell a story, and we use the artifact as the midwife of telling the story. Meaning that the artifact is not a value not only a value in and of itself, but it's a value as the vehicle for telling a story. So if you've been to Washington, you know the power of the railroad car. And the power of the railroad car is precisely that's where it shapes you as you go through the experience of deportation. And elsewhere we'll show how that's shaped. You had several problems in the inception of the and by the way, and let's talk about it, when we shaped the President's Commission on the Holocaust, the question was, where do you build? Do you build a memorial museum? And notice it's called the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, 2 functions, memorial and museum. Do you build it in the city with the memorial, with the largest Jewish community, do you build it for the bereaved community? Or do you say that we can transport it to the center of American national life, and it has something profound to say to the American future? What is the cost of that? What is the power of that? What is the opportunity of that? And what is the responsibility of that? And will people be actually interested? And consequently, the decision that we made in the early years was we make it in Washington, not New York. Not that New York shouldn't have a museum. The Museum of Jewish Heritage does that. But the idea is that if you build it in Washington, you're saying something about what it says to the national conscience. It's a national conscience. And then we got a piece of land that was controversial because one of the issues is it on the mall or not on the mall? We did a focus group, and the focus group had no objection to a Holocaust museum that was adjacent to the National Mall, but had a deep objection to a Holocaust museum that was on the National Mall, marring the holy sacred space. Now, we then decided that the controversy is an opportunity. And by the way, that reflected itself in architectural choice, for example, to take the museum's memorial part and to make it go back 20 feet with the principle that it would only stand on the sight lines of the building next door, which was the Mint, as if somehow sight lines became sacred territory. So they shrank it because they didn't want it on the mall. They did that as an architectural decision, but maybe behind it was we don't want it that close. We then said, wait a minute here, if we're building it in Washington, we want to make it something that is the counter testimony to everything around us. So what did we do with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? We first of all made a virtue of its necessity, and then a principle of its location. Everywhere on the National Mall, they celebrate the triumph of humanity. Human power in art and music and literature and technology and space and science, in economics. The power and the majesty of government. The monuments, it's the intersection between museum and monumental Washington, just adjacent to governmental Washington. So we positioned the museum in such a way that it would say, okay, but human power can be used for the creative good. Government can be used as an instrumentality of protecting and defending human rights, and government can be used what? As an instrumentality of oppression. The choices within the nature of government and the power of the values that undergird that. So we became the dark side of humanity, the darkest expression of human beings when they use the power that is celebrated absolutely elsewhere. And they marshal it not toward preserving human rights and human dignity, but to destroying human rights and human dignity, destroying people. So the idea is that you take what you face as a challenge and you use that power to create in such a way that you, in a very deep sense, in a real sense, magnify the importance. Second problem we faced, and we faced this in a certain respect during the chairmanship, and I was not there at that time, during the chairmanship of Elie Wiesel. And I say this with love for Elie Wiesel, with reverence for his achievement. But Elie had a major problem because if you read his work, the story of the Holocaust cannot be told. Only those who were there will ever know, and those who were there can never tell. Now, I had to understand this, and it took me a long time, and I've written a book on Elie. The question is, how could a man at one hand speak for silence and not speaking about it, and yet write 56 books that, speak about it all the time, give hundreds of speeches that talk about the Holocaust? And then I read a segment in Martin Buber's book in which he said, the more powerful the event, the more it invites the silence of all tongues. But speak we must. Such is the melancholy of man, also his greatness. And all of a sudden I realized that what Eli was speaking about was that if he really were to be faithful to the event, he would have to remain silent. But the urgency to speak was absolutely profound. Therefore, what comes out is melancholy and greatness, but also silence and the sense that to speak is to betray. Those of you, and this is a Catholic institution, or arguably a Catholic institution, those of you who understand that maybe the greatest mystics never wrote anything and we have no access to what they experienced of God. Every mystic we read encountered God and came down to write inadequately in the human form. And to speak of their experience in the human form, maybe the greatest mystics really opted for silence. And all we have are the poor compromises who tried to give voice, inadequate as it may be, to their experience. So when we began to create after Eli's chairmanship, we took the first part of his story seriously, and the second part of his story we suspended. Only those who were there will ever know meant that we had to listen acutely and attentively to the voices of survivors who come close to being able to tell it. And we don't know whether they can or cannot tell the story until we what? Try to tell the story using their voices and hearing their words, their silence, what they say and what they don't say. We ran into a very early problem. And this problem was philosophical, couldn't be solved, and then we ended up solving it in a very particular way. Who were the victims of the Holocaust? And the simple answer is, for most people, the question of the victims of the Holocaust are Jews. The question, though, is Jews are only Jews, or were there other people who saw themselves as victims of Nazism and now wanted to opt for that status of victims of the Holocaust? Could we build in Washington while there are people who felt left out of the story? And perhaps my unique contribution to this was to say that if you dealt that the tension between those who wanted Holocaust only and Jews only, and the uniqueness of the Holocaust to Jews alone, and the story of those who wanted to include everybody could be meshed. Because how do you tell what is unique about the fate of the Jews without understanding the role of all the other victims of Nazism? Let me give you a simple series of examples. If you want to talk about the use of gas chambers, the symbol of the Holocaust, the reason it's called the Holocaust, the origin of gas chambers has to do with the murder of the handicapped. The first to be gassed were mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught, congenitally ill Germans. And it was for them that the gas chamber first was developed. There's a signed order by Adolf Hitler. So you can't talk about the gassing of Jews without talking first and including what happened to these people in Germany who were called A, life unworthy of living, useless eaters, people who consume our resources, and who were killed by doctors in a medicalized process, which also developed the phenomenon of the desk killer, meaning that you filled out a form and the end result was that people died. You didn't have to strangle them, you didn't have to shoot them, you didn't have to go after them directly. So if you want to talk about gassing and its origin, you must include those who died, who were murdered in this, and you also should include the fact that that process ended because the German public protested. Because if you have a kid who's institutionalized, you don't care for that kid less, you care for that kid more. If your kid who's institutionalized died, the first person you speak to is somebody else whose kid was institutionalized. When you hear that 2 died, you have a problem. When you hear that 3 died, you have a catastrophe. When you hear that 5 died, you have a policy. And therefore, that was stopped by public protest later on when it came to the killing of the Jews by gas. Public protest was what? Mute and silence. How do you speak about the role of Jews who were victims not because of what they did, but because of the fact that they were Jews, without understanding the difference between what happened to Jews and what happened to political dissidents and social democrats, what happened to communists and what happened to people who opposed Nazism? One group was victimized for what they did, the other group was victimized for what they were. How do you talk about the involuntary nature of persecution without comparing what happened to the Jews to the fate of Jehovah's Witnesses? Jehovah's Witnesses were killed or were victimized not because of what they did, but because of what they refused to do. They would not register for the draft. They would not say Heil Hitler. They would not swear allegiance to the German state. And they would not stop proselytizing. And they could get out of the camp if they signed a form saying, I renounce Jehovah's Witness, and in one sense, I will no longer proselytize. And one of the things when I speak to the Jehovah's Witnesses groups, I say that if I had been a Jehovah's Witness, I would have signed that form. Because I did not think the Nazis were inhabitants of a common moral universe where my word to them would count for anything. And I would not have wanted to give them the opportunity to victimize me or victimize any of my group. I would just sign it and say that they're not worthy of my keeping my word. And then they get into a debate, but we would have betrayed our word for God, to God. And I said God would have understood. And in one sense, you would have protected the Nazis from deeper sin by walking the hell out of there. But if you want to describe the involuntary nature of Jewish victimization, begin to say that Jews who converted were victimized, Jews whose parents converted were victimized, and contrast that for a moment. How do you explain the nature of the role of Jews without seeing the only other group that was victimized, the Gypsies? But it never was, their elimination was not significant to the future of the Nazi universe. They were not regarded as they were regarded as an irritant, not a cancer. And consequently, in certain countries it became a priority, in other countries it didn't become a priority. When the war took a bad turn, they changed their policy. So the only way you could express the uniqueness of the Jewish faith is not by exclusion, but by inclusion. And inclusion in a way that everybody would regard as fair and open and proper and respectful. And we succeeded in doing that, so much so that every other institution since then has taken exactly the same role. The New York Museum does it the same way. Yad Vashem does it the same way. Every institution describes the multiple nature of victimization in all sorts of ways. How powerful do you make the exhibition? And part of what you have to be fearful of is the walking the very thin line between a chamber of horrors and something that